Hello and welcome to part 34 of my video series on how to use Blender 2.6. In this video, I'll be covering how to set up an eye rig, which will allow us to animate a character's eyes. For this video, we'll be using the same character rig that we finished off in part 32 of my Blender series, which was the 3-part mini-series on creating an IK character rig. You can go ahead and download this file from the description area below and follow along with me. And this version of Blender, well, I'm using Blender version 2.62. If you're using something newer, that's great. So let's go ahead and get started. For this video, we'll actually be creating some eyes, and then some eye bones, and some eye target bones, and we'll be making the eyes be controlled by bones, and those bones will have constraints to always be pointing at a set of target eye bones. Now, this is one way of doing eyes. Another way of doing eyes is to just animate pupils of eyes, which would be a separate object. Or another way would be to just animate the texture on a eye that isn't round. So you can animate just the texture moving along the surface of an eye, or just the pupil, or in this case, you can animate just the eye balls themselves with a texture on them. So first thing we have to do is create the eyeballs. So let's go ahead and put our 3D cursor about where we want the eye to be. And of course, I have to make sure it's in the right spot from the front and the side. So my 3D cursor right about there. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the screencast keys so you can see what I'm pressing down here, hopefully most of the time. And let's go ahead and press Shift A and add a UV sphere. UV sphere makes a great eye because it has these concentric rings. But before I get there, I'm going to actually turn down the number of segments and rings in the UV sphere. So that's not quite as high res of a mesh. So maybe 24 by 12 rings. And so now it's a simpler mesh, and now I can scale it down. You can't scale it. If you want to change the segments and rings, you have to change these first before you scale or rotate or move the UV sphere. So I'll press S to scale this way down to about the right size. We're going to make kind of cartoony Simpson kind of eyes. And because those concentric edge loops are at the top and the bottom of the UV sphere, and those are going to make really great pupils or faces to apply textures to or materials to for pupils, I'm going to rotate the eyeball so those circles, or at least one end of with the circles, the North Pole, essentially is pointing forward. So I'm going to go to the side view by pressing 3, of course, and then I'll press R and -90 and then enter. That's better than just doing a freehand rotate with the R key, because you can actually press R for rotate and then a angle, which is 90 degrees negative, so left in this case. Let's go ahead and move that eyeball back a little bit. So I'll use the gizmo and just pull back on the blue axis. Actually, I have normal turned on. I'm not sure why. That'll be the green axis in most cases if you're in global orientation. So let's go ahead and go into edit mode of the eye. And actually before that, we will go and add a material to the eye. We're going to add white to most of the eye. So in object mode, we're going to go to the materials tab and press new, and then change our color to white just by sliding that up. And because most eyes in cartoons are brighter than everything else in the scene, we'll turn up the emit value just to 0.2, and that'll make it a little bit brighter, less receiving of shadows. And then maybe turn the specular down. Sure. Now we'll make a second slot for a second material. If you're not following this, by the way, I did make a video on materials and colors and how to add multiple materials to an object, which is exactly what I'm doing right now. So if I'm not really going through this slowly enough, you can go ahead and check out that video. I'll put the link on the screen right now. So let's go ahead and make a second material. We'll make it black for the pupil, and then turn down the specular and then the emit up just to make it a little bit more solid of a color. And in edit mode, I'm going to make another edge loop by pressing Ctrl R for the knife tool, and then I'll make the cut right there, just because we don't want our pupil to be either that small or that one's too big, I think, so I made one in the middle. And so to select all of these faces inside of this edge loop, I'm going to use face select mode right there and select one of these inside faces and then press Ctrl plus. And then we have all the inside ones, and now I can shift right click to deselect that one, and then Ctrl plus again to select all the faces that I want. And now I can select the second material and press Assign. I'll go back into object mode, press Smooth, go to the front view, and now we have to create a duplicate eye. So actually what I'll do first is I'm going to change the view type of the character mesh. And if you're not using the same character mesh as me, that's okay. But it is a good idea to change the display type of that object. So we go up to the Object tab in the Properties window and change the display type to wire, so we can see the edges the edges of the character and see through the character, so we can see exactly all around our eyes. This will also allow us to see the very middle point of our character, which in this case is exactly 0 in the entire world, because the X and Y axes, or the Z or Z axis and the X axis and the Y axes all meet at this point right there. The character is exactly 0 on the X axis. So if I go ahead and duplicate this eye, I'll press Shift D to duplicate, and then to constrain it to go left and right, I'll press X. We'll move it over, and we want these two eyes to be the same distance away from the middle of the character, which is exactly 0 of the world. I can just copy the X value of the eye and then paste it to this object's X value, but then negative of that value. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's go ahead and open up our Properties panel, which is the N key, and then go up to the top where it says Transform. And if you have a selected object, it'll tell you the location, rotation, scale, and dimensions of that object. In this case, the original eye is 6.247 centimeters away from this center line. It's at 6.247 centimeters on the x-axis. So I'm going to copy that value, so I'll click and then Control C to copy, and then I'll select the other eye, and we want it to be the exact same value but negative, because the center line is the is 0 on the x-axis. So I'll go into the x value of this new eye and press Control V and then type a negative in front of it, and now we know it's equidistant from the center of the character. Let's go ahead and add some bones. So in this character we already have a bone structure, and it already controls the mesh of the character. If you're following along with me, you can just follow along with me. But there's two kind of ways that you can go about making eyes or eye bones or an eye rig for a character. You can create its own rig, its own armature structure, or you can just add more bones to your existing structure. We already have a bone structure here. It's called armature, I believe. Yeah, it's just called armature. And we can add more bones to this, that's fine. Or we can add a new armature structure which will have its own bones. But in this case, I'm going to add more bones to our existing structure. So when we make bones for eyes, we want a bone for each eye, and we want that eye bone to rotate from the exact same starting point as the eyeball actually would, which is the exact center of the eyeball. And so to create a new bone at the exact center of that eye, we want to put this 3D cursor exactly in the middle of the eyeball. Exactly. So there actually is a very easy way of doing that, of getting this 3D cursor to the very middle of this eye, and that is the snap menu. If I select the eyeball that I want, in this case the left eye, and I press Shift S, that'll bring up the snap menu. And from here I can say send my 3D cursor to the selected object, cursor to selected. So I'll click that, and it'll put my 3D cursor exactly where the center of the object that I have selected is. In this case, because it's a UV sphere, the center of all the vertexes, or the median point of them, is the very middle of the eyeball, which is what we want. So now let's go ahead and add the bone for that eye. So I'm going to go and select the armature, or one of the bones in the armature, and then I'll press Tab to go into edit mode, and I'll press Shift A to add a new bone to that armature, and it goes ahead and adds it to the middle of that eye, or the base of that bone to the middle of the eye. I'm going to go ahead and change the display type of my armature from B-bone back to octahedral under the Object Data tab, and then the bones will look just like their default pointy shape. I'm going to go ahead and move the point or the tail of that bone down, And it's pointing straight up right now, but we actually want it to point straight forward to the middle of the pupil of the eye. So we're actually going to grab this tail and move it down to the exact same middle point of the eye, and then just move it forward, because that'll guarantee us that the bone is pointing exactly straight forward. So with the tail of that bone selected, I'm going to press Shift S for the snap menu again, and then instead of cursor to selected, we're going to say selection to cursor. So what we have selected, the tail, will go to the cursor. So now both the head and the tail of that bone are at the cursor, but I'll grab my green arrow and then just drag that forward to make the bone point exactly forward. And we want that bone to go just the front of the eye. It doesn't have to be exact, but as close as you can kind of eyeball it. Pun intended. That was bad. Okay. Let's go ahead and duplicate that bone, because we're going to have a bone for each eye, but we also need a bone for its target. We're going to have another bone out kind of in front of the head that this bone will be constrained to always point to. So let's go ahead and from the side view, press Shift D with that bone selected, and then press Y, because we're going to constrain that once we duplicate it to the Y axis, and just move it out front. That's not a bad distance, because we can still see both of them from a pretty acceptable distance. Maybe a little bit further, sure. And let's go ahead and name these bones. So that bone will be called, under the bone tab, I.L, because that's actually the character's left side. And this will be IIK.L. And now we can duplicate those two bones for the other side. That'll make it easier for us to make them even. So I'm going to select those bones, and now we're going to do the exact same thing as we did to duplicate the arms and legs from the left side to the right side. And so this is a few steps. First, we have to put our 3D cursor in the very middle of our scene. So we'll press Shift C, and then we're going to change our pivot point where any object rotates or scales around from, so the point from which objects rotate around. And that is done by changing this menu down here. By default, it's at median point, or the pivot point is at median point, but we'll change it to 3D cursor. We're going to have all objects scale around or rotate around the 3D cursor, which is now in the middle of the scene because we press Shift C. And now I'm going to select those two bones, which I do in edit mode, and we'll duplicate them. So Shift D, and then I'll right click to put them back in the exact same spot. And now from the front view, I'm going to press S to scale, and then X because we're going to constrain it to just left and right, and then -1, and then enter. So they're in the right spot now. I'll just redo that to review. So I duplicated them and then right clicked, and then I pressed S, X, -1, enter. And now we've created, or the duplicate bones have moved over to the exact right spot, but they have the wrong names. They have, like, instead of .R, which we want, they have .L.001. So we can change that very easily while they're still selected by going to armature and flip names. And now they have the correct .R. We have almost all the bones we need. We just need one more bone. But before we go ahead and add that, let's go ahead and change the 3D pivot point back to median point, because that's what it should always be at. And you'll notice that when I have the eye and the eye target selected, because we have the median point pivot point selected, the gizmo is in the median point between the two selected objects. And that's good because we're going to select the two eye targets, or the two eye IK bones, and we're going to add a new bone, a third bone, which will be in between these two bones, which will be the parent of them, because we ultimately only want to have one eye target. We want to have one bone that we animate and grab and move to make the eyes point in that direction, not two separate bones, because eyes don't normally move separately. So we'll create one new bone in between those 2 points, and of course wherever the 3D cursor is, we want to add a new bone, or that's where it adds a new bone. So to put the 3D cursor right in between those two selected eye target bones, we'll press Shift S to snap, and then cursor to selected. And because we have median point, pivot point selected, and we selected those two objects, the 3D cursor goes right there. And we'll press Shift A to add a new bone, make that bone a whole lot shorter by grabbing its tail, and maybe I'll move it down a little bit. Yeah, sure. That looks good. We'll make these two bones children. So I'll press A first to deselect all, select these two bones, and then the bone last, of course with the shift key and right click, and then make these two bones children of this middle eye target bone. So I'll press Ctrl P and keep offset. Let's go ahead and name this bone, not to bone, but let's call it eye underscore target. And we're ready to set up the constraints. I'm going to select one of the eyes first, so maybe the left eye, and then hold shift, and actually, you know what? It's the other way around. Let's go ahead and select the left eye target first, and then hold shift and select the left eye, the same corresponding eye, so both left bones, and then we'll press shift I. And that's going to add, actually we have to be in pose mode, excuse me. We'll select the left eye target, hold shift, select the right eye target, and then shift I. And that's going to add the same IK constraint that we used for all the leg bones and arm bones to make the IK bones in the hands and feet work. So I'm going to select those two and then press shift I and then add IK to active bone. And because we selected two bones and we selected the target bone first, and then the actual bone that we want to have constrained to be pointed towards the target bone second, pressing IK will work. It'll actually automatically add the IK constraint to the last bone that we selected out of the two, and it made the first bone that we selected the target. So now we have to change the chain length to 1. And by the way, all of what I'm explaining right now we covered quite thoroughly in my IK actual rig mini-series. So if you can't follow me, I would go ahead and watch the mini-series on the entire rig, and you'll understand and you'll see where I'm coming from with the eye bones. The eye and the eye target are going to work a whole lot the same as the elbow targets and the knee targets. They're separate, but they kind of influence the way that their constrained bone is pointing. Same thing with the eye. The eye bone is constrained to look at the IK bone. So now if I go back into pose mode, and actually that's edit mode, so I'll go into, we are in pose mode right now, okay good. Let's go ahead and select the target bone for that eye, and if I grab it, you'll see that the eye is pointing to follow it. And that's great, but I'm going to undo, and then maybe Alt-R to, or Control-R. I just kind of lost my train of thought there. Or Alt-G, because we moved it, not rotated. Okay, let's go ahead and do the same thing for the right eye. Let's go ahead and select in pose mode the right eye target, hold shift, select the right eye, and then press shift I to add IK to the active bone, and click. And now change our chain length to 1. And now we have both eyes set up to point at these two bones, but because this middle eye target bone is these two bones' parent, we can just grab the target bone, or the eye target parent, and move both eyes at the same time. Great. Now, let's go ahead and make the eyes children of the eye bones. Unlike with the rest of the armature, though, we actually don't want the eyes to deform, the actual eye meshes, to deform with the bones. The key word there is deform. We do not want the eyes to deform bones. We want the eyes, the eye meshes, we should actually go ahead and name those. So I'll select that eye and go I.R and then I.L. We want these objects, these meshes, to be parent to the bones, just as if the bones were meshes. We want this mesh to be a child of the bone, but not deform it, just like two normal objects would be parented to one another. So we can go ahead and, as long as the bones are in pose mode, you can do that. So we'll select the eye first, and then hold shift and select the corresponding bone, and press Ctrl P to make the second object selected the parent. And then we're going to set the parent to not with automatic weights. We don't want anything to deform, but we want the mesh to be a child of the bone. So we'll select bone. And that way, this mesh is just a child of this bone, and there's no deformation going on, but it will follow the rotation of that bone. Let's go ahead and do the same thing again with the left eye. Let's select the mesh for the eye, hold shift, select the bone, and then press Ctrl P and set parent to the bone. And now we should be able to grab the bone for the eye controller, or the parent of the two IK bones, and move it, and it'll point the eye. Very last step, we have to parent these two eye bones to the head bone. Otherwise, in the mesh, I can go ahead and rotate the head and the eyes follow along. We're going to make these two eye bones children of the head bone. So we'll go into edit mode, press A to deselect all, select the two eye bones, of course with shift and then right click. Select the head bone last, and then we're still in edit mode. We'll press Ctrl P and keep offset, not connected. We don't want these bones to jump over there, so we will select keep offset. And now back into pose mode, we can grab the eye target and it'll point the eyes, and our eye setup is done. That's pretty much it. The only other thing that you could do is you could parent this eye target to the Fred controller bone, the master controller of everything else in your mesh. You don't have to do that. It's not ideal in every situation, but I will just to demonstrate. Otherwise, if you grab this master Fred bone and move the character, the eyes will still keep on pointing at that eye controller bone. But you just want to move the entire thing and have the eyes continue to point forward. That's really up to you. But I'm going to go back into edit mode in the bones and then select the eye target bone, then select the Fred controller bone and press Ctrl P and keep offset. So now in pose mode, if I move the Fred controller bone only, it still moves everything and the eyes remain